Welcome, everybody. So happy to have you all here for this Believe in Serverless session. Remember, we've got a lot of things lined up for you so we can all learn together. Remember, we have a public calendar. Let me show this real quick. We have the public calendar on the believeinserverless.com/calendar route. This is where we'll have all our sessions that are getting scheduled. You can subscribe to this calendar and make sure you're up to date on everything that we're doing. Tomorrow, as you can see here, I'll be doing a live coding session where I'll be taking App Composer for a spin. So I'll be building an application from the ground up using AWS App Composer and Step Functions Workflow Studio directly from VS Code. So hopefully y'all can join me. This month is all about APIs. And if you know me, you know that I'm a pretty big REST API fan. So I'm very, very excited to introduce Kevin Swiber, API strategy lead at Postman, to talk to us about building APIs developers love. Welcome, Kevin. How are you doing?
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. I love REST API, so I could talk about them forever. I'll have me on all month.
Sweet. We're trying to dig into different types of APIs as well. So we do have a lineup for GraphQL APIs, gRPC, and I know at Postman y'all have breadth and depth in these knowledge. So we'll definitely be talking to more of your colleagues probably around these topics.
Excellent.
Cool. I want to remind or just let everybody know this talk is we meant to be interactive, so I'll be here asking questions. If there are any questions, make sure to just pop them in the comments, and we'll make sure they get addressed when they come in. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Kevin.
Great. Thank you.
Boom.
Excellent. Let me come here and start this. Perfect. Well, hi everyone. As mentioned, my name's Kevin. I work at Postman right now. And I've been in the API service provider space for the last 12 years. So I've worked at companies like Apogee, doing API gateways, API management, a couple of other startups along the way. Prior to my life working in the sort of API service provider side, I was in enterprise architecture, working for enterprises in the Midwest of the United States, and have a background in software engineering. I've done operations. I've done process improvement stuff. I've done just about everything you can do in the enterprise. And now get the opportunity to talk to folks like you about APIs. So yeah, really happy to be here. Really glad to be talking to you all today. So today we're going to talk about building REST APIs developers love. There's a bunch of different angles you can kind of take when addressing this topic. I wanted to zoom out a little bit and kind of look at the bigger picture around APIs. So we won't really be getting into a whole lot of like design particulars today, although I do love those conversations. This is more about, we've got an API program. What does that really mean for us? How do we really approach that API program? And what are some decisions we can make along the way while building those APIs? So I'm gonna start out by kind of taking a look at the history of how we got where we are today with APIs, and then go over some lessons learned in having customer conversations that I have pretty regularly, just some things that frequently pop up. And then we'll move over into some options that folks are faced with pretty regularly, and they're evaluating: do I do A or do I do B? And we'll talk about that a little bit, and what our recommendation is. Um, but first, there's three things I like to talk about with APIs, uh, kind of from the get go. And what we're really concerned about is building API consumer confidence. Addressing any kind of developer market is really difficult. And when you're an API provider, you're producing an API, even if this is just internal to your organization, the consumer experience is incredibly important, and we want to build confidence in that consumer. Um, These three things actually come from working on brands, like big brands, and things that they look for. But I feel like it applies in a lot of different ways. So, three things to sort of keep in mind here is that we want to be credible. Do we have a history of helping our consumers be successful? We want to be relevant. Are we solving problems that they actually have today? And we want to be differentiated. Is there a unique value proposition that we're putting forth to accelerate the consumer's progress? Um, and when we have all these three things, it is a great recipe. And this is sort of something I use when I'm looking at building a new API. Do we have these three things present? And if not, what's missing here? Um, so just something to keep in mind. Uh, I tend to think of our progress through APIs coming in kind of three big waves, at least since 2000, 2001 or so. If we look at probably around 2005, this is a Wardley map, by the way. So on the y-axis here, we have a value stream, and on the x-axis, going from left to right, these are different sort of phases of the evolution. So Genesis is like the birth of an idea. Custom built is when there's really no product we can buy for this, but we as an enterprise we're gonna build some solution. Product and rental is either, hey, I can buy this off the shelf, or there's a SaaS product I can do. And commodity for us in this space is usually going to be like an AWS, or a big cloud provider, that's doing sort of utility based pricing. So, um, if we take a look at kind of our first wave here, um, we started by doing kind of all custom services to meet this increasing integration demand. More and more businesses were getting online, more and more businesses were getting connected. And so we started to build out these services. And this idea of service oriented architecture started to take shape. And tons of products in the SOA space started to come about. And so, we all bought those products. And the the effect of that success is that we needed to demonstrate that the business values of services more and more, and the demand only really increased. And to kind of meet that increasing business opportunity is where we have our second wave with really the introduction of the term APIs for these network-based communications. Right, it was kind of always there, but then we kind of really leaned on REST and RESTful APIs, as sort of our network communications protocol there. Oh, not a protocol, but our network communications style. Um, and this led to this idea of API management. So we're probably talking around 2010ish, around that time. And so instead of doing everything ourselves and custom built, we could buy API management products to help us. That's gateways and developer portals and all sorts of things. Um, and that what a lot of folks kind of didn't expect at the time was this idea of microservices really taking off. And hey, can we take what we've learned in APIs and really scale this out? And along the way, we started kind of changing the makeup of our organizations too. This idea of DevOps starts to take off. We have a book come out called Team Topologies that a lot of folks start to adopt. We start having stream aligned teams that are cross functional. They're able to align themselves to some area of the domain of the business. They're able to do the full software development life cycle, kind of in their own little bubble, and we've got many of these teams, right? Um, and what that kind of led to was this massive API sprawl. So we've got folks who are now working independently. They have that autonomy. One of the things from Team Topologies is the idea of having a platform team, and that kind of did not take off. It's starting to take root now. But that absence of that platform team meant we've got a lot of things like duplicate APIs that are out there, zombie APIs that are out there. And because of this, we kind of see this split happen in the API management space, where traditionally a lot of these products were focused on API runtime policy enforcement. So things like caching and security and rate limiting. We've got so traffic mediation, all sorts of things that are in that runtime policy place. But now with so many APIs out there, the idea of doing this collaboration around the API lifecycle becomes much, much more important. And we start to see some products come out in that space, Postman included. Um, and one thing we run into, even with open source stuff, is that as we start to head into this kind of commodity, and we can think of like AWS API Gateway as being like one of those products that is a utility, is a commodity now. Um, there is a lot of inertia in being able to address those lifecycle collaboration issues. Um, so I like to think of as we kind of go through the presentation, kind of think of these two things as being separate but related. Um, and really, a big message here is going to be: don't forget how important that API lifecycle collaboration really is. Because as we've moved forward and we're starting to run into commodity with things like API gateways, uh, there's a much larger focus on collaboration around that API lifecycle. Okay. Um, so just a little bit of history there on how we got here. This is from the Postman 2023 State of the API report. I think a new one is probably going to be coming out in a couple of months for 2024. But just to get an idea of how much time folks are spending with APIs, it's a lot. 26% of respondents, and I think there's something like 40,000 respondents for the Postman State of the API report. It's the biggest API report, and why I pull from it, other than me being employed there. But 26% of respondents work more than 20 hours a week on APIs, and 39% work 10 to 20 hours a week. I mean, that's half your work week if you're working a 40-hour work week, just working with APIs. So this stuff ends up being very important. People are spending a lot of time with APIs, and it's not just on the production side, but also on the consumption side, because you can't produce so many APIs with also having so many consumers out there as well. So I'm just going to go through some lessons learned in talking with customers who are going through this journey, and trying to figure out how to position their API programs, how to build their APIs, and what's really important. We'll start off with some higher level stuff, and then as we move into kind of the options and responses to those options that folks are dealing with, it'll be a little bit lower level. But one of the things we've really discovered is that APIs require holistic thinking. And this kind of takes us out of, just working in this autonomous team space, but really reaching out to other folks as well. One thing I like to encourage folks to do is to make like an API lifecycle map that goes across every phase of your SDLC, shows who key stakeholders are, and kind of maps what artifacts are moving through it, what products are being used alongside of it. It comes in super handy when communicating this stuff with the folks on your team or even outside of your team. And the point here is that we always want to kind of focus on people first, and then process, and then technology. Process enables the people, technology enables both the process and the people. And some cross-cutting concerns here are going to be productivity, quality, and governance, something to keep an eye on along every phase of your life cycle. An important thing here is we've become so kind of API producer centric, and thinking about the experience of building APIs and managing APIs, operating APIs. Sometimes we forget that there's a consumer on the other end. And when you're in this situation where maybe you've got 5 APIs that do similar things, it's the consumer who really decides which one of those will win. And so we need to keep an eye on them. This is a screenshot of number of forks in Postman of a collection, but being able to have this kind of collaborative experience that includes the consumers and allows you to get some of that feedback is going to be critical. Some metrics along the way here to keep in mind, and some of these they're difficult to quantify. They're difficult to sort of collect automatically. There are companies out there who are kind of focused on like product metrics for APIs, and they've got some plugins and some things you can do to gather this. But even just starting in with surveys, with questions and answers, just reaching out to people, getting a sense of that time to the first API call is super important. Um, some people might call it time to hello world. The time to that first meaningful integration. So they haven't just made an API call, but they've actually built an application with it, and maybe they've checked in some code and it's running in staging. Time to first value is going to be, is my business actually getting value from this integration that I've built? And how long does it actually take to realize that value? And of course, developer satisfaction along the way, which we'll talk a little bit more about down the road here. I talk about design a lot. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into different design details today, but what we've discovered is that design impacts more than just, does this API feel good for me as a producer? Does it feel good for me even as a business person? Um, it really impacts all the way to debugging. If we take a look at things like observability, being able to put these kind of key markers in our traces, in our observability data, to help us figure out what's going on when things go wrong, ends up being super important. So that design does make its way all the way down to observability. Um, and just some pointers here, like look, include version identifiers and traces. It's always super important to know what deployed code you're actually working with, what API you're actually working with. We've got for folks who are worried about lock-in, vendor lock-in, there's open telemetry for some portability there. It's not 100% perfect now, but there's a lot you can do there. And of course, understanding metrics, events, logs, and traces is super helpful. Um, Again, kind of related to design, uh, a lot of folks are looking at governance projects right now. How do we get some kind of consistency across our organization? Uh, and what we found is that consistency matters, but mostly in a well-defined scope. So if you've got 5 sets of APIs with each set having a different kind of consumer experience. Do we need consistency across all those consumer experiences? Maybe that's helpful, but mostly it's helpful to have consistency within that consumer experience, right? If I'm an API consumer and I'm consuming 5 of your APIs, there should be some consistency there, right? If you don't want to like move between snake case and like Pascal casing within that same kind of experience. You don't want to within the same domain. You don't want to use different words to mean the same thing. So that consistency does matter, particularly in those scopes. And we have tools now to kind of help us with this. So this is output from Spectral CLI. We have this stuff built into Postman now too as well. So consistency within those user experiences within domains. With the tools to kind of check this stuff now, we can actually do checks not only at design time if we're designing our API up front using something like Open API, but we can do it in CI/CD as well. An interesting thing about a lot of big programs that happen around APIs and through enterprise architecture organizations is that people talk a lot about sources of truth. Um, and rarely is there ever a single source of truth that folks are managing. Uh, and there might be differences across those different things, right? So even if I've got, if I'm using, say, Git and GitHub for version control of my Open API files, maybe my local Open API file doesn't really match what's on, what's been checked in and pushed to my Git remote in GitHub. Um, and really, the only thing that you can rely on is what's in production. When it comes to that consumer experience, at least whatever's in production is what's going to matter to them. Um, So it's important to kind of figure out what your sources of truth are, but really use observability, use even surveying, talking to your customers to check the reality of it all. And finally, here, like what tends to happen is folks start taking their APIs seriously. They start putting together not only things like gateways, but figuring out collaboration workflows, process, everything around that. And what starts to emerge is an API platform. And sometimes this isn't very easy to recognize. But you can start to look at, are you centralizing components for authorization? Are you Where are you doing your design reviews? Is GitHub part of your API platform? When you've got a problem in an API contract, how are those actually getting resolved? um, that's really where you start to kind of piece together whether or not you've got an API platform. um, and this is just kind of a cheat sheet of everything we talked about. Again, this is stuff that uh, comes up a lot, problems that folks are struggling with, and kind of insights into having lots of customer conversations. Um, but now we're going to go into some kind of open options that might not always have a very clear answer, and some things that folks are struggling with. Um, and one of them is really like, how do we think of new software? What are we really delivering? Um, are When we get a new project that comes to us, are we really just building a single page app? Um, that is going to have APIs that never really leave the scope of that single page app. Um, or are we building a group of interfaces for different use cases? Are we only going to have a human user uh, approach our application, or are we going to have different integration needs going forward? Um, and really, like when typically when building software products today, we're always thinking API first. So, and this doesn't, I think API first is a little bit misleading as a term. Um, but I think what we really want to look at is the group of interfaces that we need to deliver as a software team to our consumers, and that might be it might be a CLI, right? It might be a web interface, and it might be an API. And do we need feature parity across all of that? And particularly with kind of the rise of single page apps, it's made it a little bit more possible for us to try to centralize some of that functionality and some of that experience in an API, and then leverage that API across the other interfaces that we have. So, I think API first makes sense in that way, but we can't forget that they are different user experiences, right? Like your CLI experience won't be the same as your web experience, won't be the same as your API experience. But thinking about how we can enable reuse across those interfaces is important, and thinking about them as a group as opposed to in isolation can be helpful. Um, when we use this phrase API first, and we ask companies or human beings at those companies, is your company API first on a scale of 0 to 10? We see a lot of people right now, and again, this is from the 2023 Postman State of the API report. We see most people are feeling like they're kind of right in the middle, right? Like about a quarter of the respondents said, oh yeah, like out of a 0 to 10, we're kind of a 5 on API first. Um, and I expect we'll see that be this similar for this year, with more and more folks, more of the sixes, seven, eights, nines, tens rising over the next few years. I think a lot of folks are still trying to figure this out, which makes sense kind of given our timeline and where we are in our maturity and evolution. Um, Another thing is how do we really think of our APIs? Are they just abstractions over a database for integrations, or are we really looking at a set of capabilities for consumers? More of a kind of product lens on our APIs. There's not always a kind of a straightforward answer to this. Um, but when it matters, treating APIs as products goes a long way. Um, and we could talk a little bit more about this through some of the questions later on, um, that I'll go over. But um, APIs as products is not a new thing. When I was at Apogee 12 years ago, we were talking about APIs as products and had stuff in our product that helps support that. Um, and my colleague from around that time, actually, Marsh Gardner, talks about products as needing a few things to be considered a product. You need a producer of some kind or a supplier. You need a consumer of some kind. And those are likely different parties, not the same party. You need some kind of transaction between producer and consumer, and you need some repeatability. That producer is probably going to have multiple consumers over time. Even if it only has one to begin with, it needs to be able to repeat that process of creating new transactions with more consumers. Um, and so, if your API has those kind of constraints around it, looking at treating it like a product is going to go a long way. And that includes lots of things like making sure that you're involving consumers in the conversation. It's no longer just an abstraction to talk to this really closed ecosystem, but it's really expanding. Um, API discovery is a huge thing, particularly with the API sprawl that we've seen, and again, these sort of autonomous teams putting together APIs in isolation. Um, we've had these developer portals for a long time. Sometimes they're associated with a gateway, sometimes they're custom. Now folks are using things like Backstage as developer portals. And then we have this idea of API networks. Postman has an API network. There are a few other API networks out there. There are marketplaces as well, which we won't touch on too much. But this idea of having something that's kind of outside my control, but is in a centralized place where people can go and discover APIs. So there's always a question of where do we invest our time? Do we do the custom developer portal? Do we work on those API networks? What we've really seen is like at scale, both are important. So to give an example here, one of the most cited best developer documentation experiences out there is Stripe. Stripe has a huge API surface. They have excellent docs around their API. And they're also really committed to having collections and things up on the Postman API network, because they understand that folks are doing discovery in multiple places. They understand that if they can broaden the size of their funnel, they're going to get more traction, right? So at scale, kind of using both of these things makes sense. And even if you're not doing a public API, but you've got consumers internally in your organization, there are private API networks. There are things you can share with partners. There are this kind of network concept that you can work into really every kind of use case in visibility of your API. And the importance of doing that is like leveraging these network effects. So if you're using a network, they've got a bunch of consumers that are there. They've got a bunch of producers that are there, and typically there's visibility into who's doing what. So if your friends are consuming new APIs there, they'll see it, they'll share it with their friends, like it'll, and things just start to explode in kind of a positive way. Um, and through these connections, it's not just consumer. You've got the consumer producer connections that are happening as well, which are important. Um, Documentation. I just heard someone say that documentation is something that no one wants to write, but everyone wants to read. And I think like that's true for a certain group of folks, for certainly for a lot of developers out there. Um, and so, like one of our shortcuts here is, can we auto generate documentation from code? Or do we do a more handcrafted experience? And it is particularly with AI these days, being able to, submit to an LLM your design and get some kind of human documentation back, that can help you go from 0 to 1 pretty easily. From having a blank page to have something there. Um, but to really focus on that consumer experience, you're gonna need to fill in the gaps a little bit more. Uh, Even if we're using, annotations or attributes or decorators, whatever your language calls them, on controllers to generate open API on the back end, are we really filling out all those annotations? Are we really including examples of requests, examples of responses? Probably not. When it's done really well and all that information is there, it adds a lot of code to your code files, to your controllers, right? And so we tend to not do it. Um, but we could use that as a way to kind of get launched from having 0 to something, and then fill in those gaps for a better consumer experience.
Kevin,
Yeah.
question around this topic, right? I typically start from the Open API and then move from there, right? Instead of the code generating the Open API. How have you seen the adoption across the industry in that kind of contract first design or development?
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end too. It's probably something that I'm a little ranty on, but I'll address that a bit more. Open API adoption has been huge. So I work very closely with the Open API initiative, and adoption has been huge. There's a lot of talk at a lot of very big companies of moving to design first mentality, moving to a design first process. But there are still tons of folks out there just generating Open API from their server side code.
Hmm.
And it is probably the majority of Open API creation out there is coming from auto generated means. So, I think step one is okay, we understand that we need something like Open API. Step two is understanding, okay, well, we need to better leverage Open API to get things like clear design constraints, like clear documentation. And then we can, use that Open API document in all the many ways you can use Open API documents, documentation, testing, all sorts of things.
Yep.
But yeah, I think people are seeing Open API as a solution. Open API usage is really growing, and we're just starting to see kind of a movement of going design first with it.
Cool. We
And again,
we do have
oh
another
sure.
question. It's from Daryl. So just wonder if you see much uptake with GraphQL APIs, or is it still a very niche approach? Niche.
Um, I definitely not as big as REST APIs. I would say definitely not as big as event-driven architecture sort of things either. Um, but there, every company that I work with has at least one GraphQL project going on, and some of them have gone very deep into GraphQL, and they've really invested, and they're doing like federated graphs, going to multiple backend services, and trying to create like a federated graph experience that is an overlay of all the data they can provide as an IT organization. So that's certainly happening, and there are whole companies built around this concept of doing this. So clearly, like it's happening out there.
Mhm.
It's just through my experience, while that's a strong market, it is still a niche market, um, and the number of REST APIs far exceeds even new when it comes to new APIs. They are mostly REST these days. But GraphQL is, I would say, it's still on the rise. I think in the Gartner hype cycle, I think GraphQL APIs are like approaching the trough of disillusionment. So we haven't reached kind of the plateau of productivity on that quite yet.
Cool.
Any other questions for now?
Nope.
Okay. We talked a little bit about how we organized teams before, and kind of organizing autonomous teams versus having, like kind of big committees and big teams that produce our software, um, or different organization models. Um, Sometimes, like, we work with folks who are wondering, should we centralize all API activity to a single team, uh, and just have other teams work on sort of back end data sources that we consume, or should we have all these multiple teams working in concert? Um, and I think if you're small, like if you're starting small, and you're trying to figure out your API best practices, starting with a single API team is helpful, um, but pretty quickly you'll run into the need to use multiple teams to scale. And I'll use Stripe as another example here. So Stripe's API surface is massive; it's just huge. Um, and there's not one team that takes care of the entire API. There's different parts of the API that different teams take care of, and for them, they still want to have consistent user experiences, consistent consumer experiences. So there is a team that will go in and kind of aggregate all these open APIs from different sub teams there, and put it together into one, and do things like consistency checks, and to make sure that everything is providing a good experience, or that the API is providing a good experience for consumers. So I think it's nice to have this idea of a single team, but like we can't scale that way, and we don't really want to undo all the things that we've done with our organizational changes. I think the team topology stuff has been really helpful for organizations. We don't really want to undo it, but having the concept of a platform team in there perhaps to help out, or even a center of enablement, a center of excellence to help out, is really useful. I've heard this question about SDKs for 15 years now, particularly working with REST APIs. And there's always the question of, do we create these SDKs in popular languages for our REST API and deliver that as part of our distribution with our API? Or do we just rely exclusively on our API and say, well, you can consume the API directly, you can make your own SDKs, whatever you want. We've seen like good use cases here. I've seen companies struggle to try to maintain so many different SDKs for so many different languages. And I think where I've seen it really go right is when they only release high quality SDKs in languages that they're already comfortable in, that they know they can provide a good experience in, and then rely on the community to come up with SDKs around their API. And this community might be internal. If you've got, particularly since we've gone to having these autonomous separate teams, people are using different tech stacks, right? So if you're the API producer and you know Java really well, maybe you produce a Java SDK. But if you've got a team who's using Go as a consumer and that's not in your wheelhouse, maybe don't create a Go SDK, right? Like, you're not going to get all the idioms right. It's not going to feel good to a Go client developer. So kind of rely on that community. Do what you can and rely on the community. And remember, you still have that API out there, right? Like, we all have API client tooling. We have HTTP client tooling that we can use. And actually creating a good SDK can be really hard. We run into issues all the time when we try to abstract away the network and pretend the network doesn't exist. However, there's still network problems that happen all the time. So, it's totally cool if you don't have the bandwidth for an SDK, but if you do, make sure you're investing in what you know is going to be high quality. Um, Otherwise, you're actually creating a bad experience for those other developers.
What are your thoughts on so I use Open API Generator. I don't know if you've heard of that one,
Yep.
but it basically it generates SDKs based off of your Open API. Would that be something you would recommend if you have good Open API governance, right? With Spectral as a linter and making sure it's following the legitimate rules to make that open API or that SDK valuable.
Yeah, I would say there's that project. There are commercial products out now that will do this with Open API. Um, I've mostly only used open source tooling around this, not the commercial stuff. And in my kind of open source usage, like there is huge variability in the quality of SDKs that come out from each language. And so I found myself basically, forking and modifying these projects, modifying these templates
Yeah.
so that they would produce something that was a little bit better for me. Um, I think that can be really useful and really helpful, but you need to audit the quality of those SDKs. I wouldn't just rely on saying, "Oh, someone's already figured this out for me. I've got my open API looking pretty good. Let me go generate that." In particular, there are things like mapping JSON schema in your open API to type systems, and sometimes that doesn't work really well in an auto-generated fashion, and you need to go in there and kind of redo what gets generated. So almost like with auto-generated documentation, you can use it as like a boilerplate for getting started, but you really kind of need to get in there and do an audit and figure out how to make that a good experience for the end consumer.
And it's definitely what we've seen. In the Open API generator, we've had to modify or create our extension of the templates to make it do what we wanted to do to make it easier to consume, right? To reduce the amount of time like you had in those metrics, the time to first call, and you had to instantiate a bunch of stuff. So yeah, we've seen that definitely.
Yeah, and I don't. I'm not saying anything bad about these projects at all. It's a hard problem to solve, and I'm told that some of the commercial options are a bit better. So hopefully there are good options out there for folks to do this. But again, I think the auditing aspect is really important, and it's helpful to get someone who is very familiar with that language to say, "Hey, does this experience make sense to you, or does it feel a little bit weird?" Because we want it to be good, and if it's not good, just use the REST API. You
Yeah.
know, so. This is a question that comes up a lot, mostly not with the larger organizations I talk to, because they have, not just company standards, but sometimes they have legislation around what their auth should look like. Um, but for the kind of small to mid-sized companies, there's always this question for them on how they handle auth. Do they use an identity provider of some kind, or do they roll their own? Um, I think uh, there are some benefits to rolling your own, mostly in the fact that you really deeply understand what's happening in your auth process, which I think is really important. Um, but some of the downsides there are, your custom auth solution hasn't been tested by security professionals more than likely. And some of the identity providers are out there, and there are open source identity providers too. Some of the identity providers out there have been really meticulously combed through not only the source code, but through outside security testing to make sure that they're high quality security tools. And these days, security isn't something you really want to mess up, right? So I know even through AWS API Gateway, you can like plug into Cognito. There's always something out there. If you're looking in the open source world, there's Keycloak, that's an identity server. I think written in kind of the .NET space, there's something called Identity Server. Um, there are a bunch of options there. There are aggregators for doing like OpenID Connect. So Dex is one of those projects that's been around for a very long time. And kind of a few others out there. And then there are, of course, commercial solutions around this as well. Um, but yeah, I think when we're talking about APIs specifically, auth is really hard, and it's one reason why it's been traditionally baked into gateways as well. And so if your gateway does this and it does it really well and it ties into a developer portal where people can manage their tokens and their access and all that stuff, great. Definitely leverage that, um, but probably don't roll your own. Where you might want to do some more custom stuff is around authorizations, like your API, and perhaps with your tokens that you're using, you're able to pull scopes out of what that token is able to access. But typically, there's deeper authorization that you have to do. Okay, this scope is included, but this user is on a certain plan, or this user has certain attributes about them that make it so that the response would be different. How do I factor all of that in? And there are tools like Open Policy Agent that are out there for helping to manage these policies around APIs as well. And AWS came out with something similar called Cedar. That's worth looking into as well. But yeah, this question is really hard. I very rarely say roll your own auth, uh, because again, it's very difficult to get right, particularly in APIs. And You probably want some more options than you have the availability to code. So, okay, we kind of touched on this a little bit before, but when we're building our APIs, we've got different paradigms that we typically look at. Do we go code first? Do we go design first? Um, why do people really like a code first approach? I think it's mostly developers who like a code first approach. And it's because we get that rapid prototyping, we get that time to first commit feels really good. It feels like home to us to be working in code. To be actually, it feels like creation, like we're creating something, right? And that feels good. Unfortunately, it does fall short in a few areas. Again, we talked about how we don't really fill in enough information to create good documentation. If we've got different developers who are working on the same API and they're doing code first, often we see a lack of design consistency. We're not really looking at what other developers have done and not really examining their code to make sure that we're being consistent in our designs. And there's longer feedback cycles. So if we're doing code first, how long does it take for a potential consumer to actually see the shape of the API that we're producing and give that feedback, right? We've got to be deployed into an environment typically before we start getting that feedback. So there are a few areas where code first does fall short. Um, and when we talk about design first, so this might be taking an open API file and putting your design in an open API file before you start writing the code. We've seen some people who use Postman collections in this way. So they'll go through and they'll create requests and Postman collections with examples of responses or examples that have request bodies in them. And they'll do this kind of specification by example approach. Well, they'll do that. Whatever your design first approach looks like, we see benefits in early collaboration with consumers. So we bring them in right away before we're deployed to an environment, before we've invested time in coding our project. Did we even get it right for you as a consumer? Having those conversations early means we'll deliver a bit faster, means we'll deliver a bit cheaper, which folks always like. There's more of an intentional evolution behind it. We don't accidentally evolve our model over time just by virtue of filling out or fulfilling our different tasks that are associated with our particular work iteration. And then those design consistency within scopes that we talked about, right? So being able to look at the model first allows us to kind of examine that and figure out consistencies there, and allows us to use things like spectral to prove that we have consistencies with our different rules that we set up. I think we shy away from design first sometimes as developers because we've had bad experiences. Most of those bad experiences were before we started doing these kind of autonomous teams by domain. Big design up front is something that used to get talked about a lot. I don't know if people talk about it much anymore, but it's this idea that we want to design everything from the get-go. We want to make sure we're thinking 3 years in advance, everything we might need, and make sure we're including that. And we know that doesn't work. Otherwise, we wouldn't have moved to more more of the style of SDLC that we have now. Lava flow is this idea that maybe design responsibility is changing hands over time, and if we're looking at the design first, um, we've got different maintainers along the way who are changing it, right? Like because the maintainers are changing, they're like, well, we didn't need this part of the API, we didn't need that part of the API, so they start taking it out, they start changing things, and it builds up this technical debt over time, and these production outages over time, typically, because things keep changing and people don't know why they're changing them. They don't know the impact of changing them. So I think that surfaces in a lot of different ways, not just in design first. And then there's the idea of design by committee, um, and really, if I need 7 people to sign off on this design, how much time is this really taking in the process? And so, we typically want to say, like, let's have one person be able to stamp their approval, maybe have a committee of folks who are coming up with these rules for consistency around design. But when folks are actually producing the software, how do we make it go faster? Um, and so to kind of, combat those those potential dangers, uh, there's this idea that's kind of the opposite of big design up front, which is just enough design initially. And really, what happens here is we're looking at that first iteration. And some of the advice is if you can take your model and put it in front of a small group of people and they make no changes, no new associations to it, then it's good enough. Just release it. And then we can get into this iterative design philosophy, particularly with something like Open API. We can do our design. We can stand up a mock server on that, and so that mock server allows us to have that consumer experience right away. So instead of consumers just looking at a design document, they're actually playing with a live API, and they get that sort of hands-on experience. And we can write tests around that too, right? We can rewrite our client tests before the server is even launched. And so having this kind of iterative design philosophy where we do the design, the mock, we test the mock, we take that information that we learned that we need changes for, put it back into that design. We're doing this whole iteration without even really having to build the server. So it makes sure that by the time we go to build the server, we're actually building something that's going to produce value for those consumers. And we've talked a little bit about API as a product, not too much, but this concept really elevates the importance of a consumer. And again, you can treat your API like a product, even if it is just internal to your organization. Um, you know, uh, so what if you still want to do code first? Okay. Um, there are some questions you have to ask yourself. Will the API surface remain small? And first, are you really uh, not in a product space? So we talked about it as an abstraction over some kind of data versus being a product. And one of the differences there was as just an abstraction over data, you're probably both the consumer and the producer, and you don't have any outside consumers, right? Uh, so will that API surface remain small if you're doing code first in that scenario? Will the producer and consumer always be one and the same? Will it always be you? And will the API have the same maintainers, or are you going to have to onboard new people to take care of this API over time? Um, if all of these three things are yes and remain yes for a significant period of time, then I think code first makes sense. But I think you need to ask yourself, how often do these three questions get answered yes in your organization? And for how long do they remain yes? Um, if you can't say yes to all three of these questions, then maybe considering design first would be a good option. And I think that's the end of my design first, code first rant. Um, I'm a big advocate of open standards in the API space and using open source. I work closely with the Open API initiative. I'm close with the async API folks, the JSON schema folks. Worked a little bit with GraphQL folks, and gRPC is kind of its own little bubble there. But they've got open communications around changing the software. Definitely get involved in these communities if stuff is important to you, and definitely leverage the technologies they create. Not only is it kind of good for the community, it helps your career, gives you some portability in your career. Everyone's using these everywhere, and so it's good to have that experience under your belt. That's it for me. Happy to take questions after this. You can reach me anywhere on the internet at Kevin Swiber, or kevin.swiber@postman.com. Thank you.
I was muted. Awesome. Great stuff. We do not have any more questions in the comments, but everything makes sense to me.
Great.
I'm a bit pusher for this. I have a question, and it's more on how to approach something, right? You mentioned a couple of times treating the APIs as a product, right? And I've tried to push this. I work for a big organization where there's already kind of product strategies and kind of a product mentality where the product's mostly been buttons on a UI, right? And lists and all that. Try to shift that mentality to an API, which they feel very far from and more techy. It's been a struggle, right? Do you have any suggestions, or have you seen this as a regular thing in the industry?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if we go back to that idea that API consumers determine if your API wins, I mean, that's any interface consumer at all. Like your web interface consumer is going to determine if you win or not. And so, if that API is a first class part of your product, it needs to be treated like a first class part of your product, because the API consumers can have just as much decision power as some of the web front end users, right? Integrations are incredibly important to businesses these days. And if they can't get the integration that they need to help the company be successful, they will go look elsewhere. So I think, kind of framing it as like, this is actually important to our product, and people make product decisions based on our API. Your product is really, when I think of product, I think of the product containing all of the interfaces together. And so either we treat this whole as a product, or we'll have inconsistencies in our experiences across the product, and that could lead to folks leaving and going elsewhere, or finding different products to choose.
Cool. Yeah. Makes sense. Cool. Well, we're almost out of time, and no questions. You do have a thanks from Danielle. Uh,
Oh,
she has to leave, but
well, happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
yeah, this was great. Lots of great information, and definitely will recommend people watch this over, since it's good for you. What you mentioned, organizations just started off, or if you already have a kind of a flow, what things you might want to change to be able to truly be API first, API driven, and maintain those APIs as products. So I really appreciate your time, Kevin, and giving this presentation. I'm pretty sure people will reach out probably on Twitter or somewhere around this. I know you're a big voice for APIs. I've been following you for some time now, and really enjoy what you produce and give the community. So
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
so we'll wrap it up. Thanks a lot. We'll talk later.
Bye bye.